Under the low and wavering light of a late autumn afternoon, the town seemed built out of shadows. The boardwalks were warped from years of sun and rain, and the dust on Main Street swirled in little eddies that caught in skirts and cuffs. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of distant wood smoke, the kind that made you think of places you had not yet been invited to call home. Inside the saloon, it was dimmer still, the walls stained with the ghosts of spilled whiskey, the air carrying an old mixture of tobacco and time. Near the far wall stood an upright piano, its mahogany dulled, its brass pedals green with tarnish. The keys were not all straight, some leaned like tired teeth and dust lay across them thick enough to write a name in. Most days it sat silent, more ornament than instrument, a piece of furniture no one cared to move but everyone had learned to ignore. She had been in town less than a week, and already whispers had preceded her like a scent. A widow, someone had said. A sharp one, said another. A woman with too much backbone for her own good, and too little in the way of fortune to make it matter. She came into the saloon that day not to drink, but because the seamstress shop upstairs had grown too warm with the smell of pressing irons, and she wanted air that wasn't laced with steam. Her dress was black, not fresh morning black but the faded shade of it, sun-bleached and threadbare at the hem. She wore it like a uniform rather than a memory. A broad-brimmed hat shadowed her face, though now and then the slant of light from the windows found her eyes, clear, dark, watchful. Men at a nearby card table were talking big as they often did in that place, about cattle prices, about riding in storms, about the sort of things they wanted the room to know they had done. One of them had taken to pounding his hand on the table to make a point, which rattled the glasses and made the piano strings hum faintly, as though remembering a song. She glanced at it and then back at the men, a faint, knowing smile tugging one corner of her mouth. "If you can play Chopin," she said suddenly, leaning a shoulder against the piano's side, "I'll marry you right here." It wasn't said sweetly, nor with the blush of a coquette. It was a dare wrapped in jest, the kind of remark meant to be laughed off. And they did laugh. Loud, exaggerated, the way men laugh when they don't quite know if they've been insulted. The piano stood between them like a half-forgotten promise, and for a long moment nothing stirred but the drifting dust. Then someone moved in the far shadows, a tall figure in a weathered coat, his hat brim pulled low. He walked with an unhurried gait, the kind that said he never rushed unless it was for something that truly mattered. He didn't look at her when he reached the piano. Instead, he brushed the dust from the keys with the edge of his hand, sat down on the worn bench, and set his fingers over the notes as if greeting something old. The first sound that rose from the instrument was soft, almost hesitant, like a voice that had gone and used too long. The melody came in pieces at first, stitched together with pauses, but the shape of it was unmistakable, Chopin, delicate and deep, reaching into the quiet corners of the room. The saloon's other sounds fell away. Even the men at the table stopped their noise, their heads turning slightly toward the music. Outside, wagon wheels rattled over the street, but in here the air felt suspended. She watched his hands, strong, calloused, yet careful on the keys. The way he played was not polished, not perfect, but there was a kind of honesty in it that made perfection irrelevant. She felt something shift in her chest, sudden and unwelcome. The note stirred up a memory she had pressed down years ago, herself as a girl at her mother's side, the lamp throwing gold light over the sheet music, the sound of a nocturne filling their parlor while supper cooled in the kitchen. That had been before the sickness, before the debts, before a life of narrowing rooms and fewer choices. He finished not with a flourish, but with a fading line that seemed to sink into the wood. The silence after was heavier than the music had been. She was about to speak, though she did not know what words would come, when the door banged open and a boy of about 7 burst in. Barefoot, hair like a mop of wheat, his face flushed from running. He looked straight at the man on the bench. "Uncle," the boy said breathless, the bass out of the pen again. The man rose without hurry, set the piano bench back under the keys, and rested one hand on the boy's shoulder. His other hand tipped his hat toward her, a motion that felt less like courtesy and more like acknowledgement. Then he was gone, taking the boy with him, leaving the piano and its stirred-up air behind. She stayed where she was, one palm still resting on the instrument's cool edge. The men at the table had returned to their cards, muttering. Outside, the street's noises crept back into hearing, the clop of hooves, the creak of leather, the far-off hammer of a blacksmith. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself he had only been proving a point, that nothing in the way he played had anything to do with her. And yet, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that the music had been meant for someone who understood what it cost to bring beauty into a room that had no right to it. Later, when she stepped out onto the boardwalk, the sun was low, painting the buildings with the kind of light that makes even worn wood look noble. She turned toward the seamstress shop, but her eyes caught on a figure far down the street. He was lifting the boy onto the back of a restless bay horse, the animal tossing its head. The man's hand was steady on the reins, his voice low and even, though she could not hear the words. He didn't look her way. Still, she found herself standing there longer than she meant to, until the chill began to seep through her gloves. That night, in the narrow bed above the shop, she dreamed not of the man but of the piano, its notes tumbling like water over stones, the melody reaching out into the dark. And when she woke, there was the faintest echo of it still in her mind, as if some part of her had been left behind in that dim room. Days in that town had a way of running together, the hours marked by little more than the sun's rise and fall, the sound of wagons on the street, the church bell on Sundays. Yet the saloon moment stayed with her, tucked between her thoughts like a pressed flower she hadn't meant to keep. She did not see him again for several days, though once she thought she caught a glimpse of him through the general store's window, standing at the counter, the boy at his side, a sack of feed over his shoulder. When she passed them later on the street, the boy glanced up at her and grinned, a quick, bright thing. The man gave a slight nod, nothing more. But she carried that nod with her as if it were something fragile that might break if she thought too hard on it. On the 6th day since the saloon, she found herself near the schoolhouse, where children's laughter spilled out through open windows. She was delivering mended shirts to the teacher when the boy from the saloon ran past, nearly colliding with her. He stopped, breathless again, and blurted, "You're the piano lady." She didn't correct him, only asked if his uncle was nearby. The boy pointed toward the edge of town, where the road bent toward open land. She followed his finger and saw the rancher there, speaking to a wagon driver, his hat pushed back enough for the sun to catch in his hair. Something about the way he stood, weight balanced, attention fixed, made her think of the way he had played that afternoon. Deliberate, unhurried, without the need to prove himself to anyone. She left the schoolhouse with her bundle of coins and mended shirts, but instead of returning straight to her room, she walked the long way around the block. Her boots scuffed against the boardwalk, the sound small in the cooling air. She told herself it was only to stretch her legs. Near the edge of town, she saw him again, leading the bay into the livery. The boy spotted her first, waving with both hands. The man looked over then, and for a moment their eyes met, just a flicker before he touched his hat brim in that same unspoken way. She could have kept walking. She nearly did. But the words rose in her before she could stop them. "You play well," she said, her voice steady though her heart beat faster than it should. He studied her a moment, then said quietly, "Not as well as I used to." His voice had the depth of someone who measured his words and kept most of them for himself. The boy came up between them, holding a folded scrap of paper. "Uncle says this is yours," he announced, thrusting it toward her. She took it, puzzled, and opened it to find a single line of music. Not the whole song, just a fragment, written in a hand both careful and worn. When she looked up, they were already moving away, the man's hand on the boy's shoulder, the bay trailing behind. She stood there in the growing dusk, the paper light in her hand, the ink already smudging where her thumb had touched it. The wind picked up then, lifting a strand of her hair and carrying with it the faintest trace of music, though she could not tell if it came from memory or the air itself. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she wondered if perhaps this town had something yet to offer her besides a bed and work. The room above the seamstress shop had a single small window, the kind you had to stand close to in order to see the street. On cold mornings, the glass held a pale film of frost, and her breath fogged it when she leaned in. From here, the town seemed quieter than it was, the voices of passing men and wagons softened, the sound of boots on boardwalks distant enough to pretend it was another place entirely. But the walls were thin, and she could hear every clang of the iron from the shop below, every hiss of steam, every murmur of women's voices as they bent over their work. She had taken the room because it was the only one she could afford without questions being asked. The rent came out of the small earnings she made mending sleeves and hems for the seamstress in exchange for space. It wasn't much, but it was steadier than some of what she'd known. The bed sagged in the middle, the wallpaper peeled in curling strips, and the stove smoked if you looked at it wrong. Still, the room was hers, if only in the way a shadow is yours until someone walks through it. Most days she stayed in the shop, head bent over fabric while the owner barked orders. The air there was heavy with the smell of scorched wool and dye. In the pauses between work, she sometimes thought of the piano in the saloon, the way the man's fingers had moved over the keys with such measured patience. She told herself she thought of the song, not the man, though the distinction grew harder to keep. It was the boy she saw first, days after that afternoon. She was carrying a bundle of finished shirts toward the schoolhouse when he came skipping along the edge of the street, his bare toes blackened from dust, a grin breaking across his face when he spotted her. "Piano lady," he said as if it were the only name she'd ever had. He was balancing something in his arms, an old shirt torn across the shoulder, and a handful of buttons that looked as though they'd been rescued from the dirt. He held it out like a peace offering. "Uncle says it's no matter, but I don't like the way it looks." She took the shirt, running her fingers over the tear. "I can fix it," she told him. "But you'll have to wait until tomorrow." He nodded solemnly, though his eyes kept darting toward the bundle she carried. She unwrapped one corner to show the neatly folded shirts inside. "Schoolhouse work," she said. "For the teacher." "Do you work for everybody?" he asked. "Only the ones who ask nice." The boy laughed and ran off before she could say more. She watched him disappear around the corner, the shirt now gone from her hands and a strange lightness in its place. That evening she found herself thinking of the boy again, not the man. The boy's unguarded way of looking at her, the way children did before they learned the weight of certain silences. She thought of his feet, bare against the street, and wondered what kind of roof he slept under. She learned the answer sooner than she expected. The next morning she was in the general store, reaching for a bag of flour that sat just out of her grasp. Her fingertips brushed the paper but couldn't get a hold. Before she could shift her footing, a hand reached past her, steady and sure, taking the bag down without a word. She looked up into the shadow of his hat brim. The rancher set the flour on the counter along with her other items, laying a few coins down before she could speak. "That's not necessary," she said, more sharply than she intended. He tipped his hat once, the motion slow, and turned to leave. The boy was waiting outside, holding the reins of a horse with a patch of white between its eyes. The man swung into the saddle and they rode away without looking back. She stood in the store with her bag of flour, the coins still glinting on the counter, and realized she didn't know how to feel. Gratitude felt too simple, pride was too heavy. She gathered her things and walked out, the sound of hooves already fading down the road. In the days that followed, the boy began appearing more often. Sometimes at the shop door, sometimes near the well, always with a reason, though the reasons were thin enough to see through. Once he brought a loose button and asked if she might sew it on. Another time he came only to hand her an apple, saying, "We had more than we needed." She began to notice other things too. When she passed the livery, the bay horse was often there, brushed and fed. When she walked near the edge of town, she could see the shape of his ranch in the distance. A small house, a corral, smoke rising in a straight line from the chimney. She imagined the boy running between the house and the barn, the man moving slow and deliberate through his work. One evening, on her way back from delivering mended coats, she found the boy sitting on the steps of the shop. His knees were pulled to his chest, and the air had turned sharp with the promise of frost. "Where's your uncle?" she asked. "Fixing the roof," the boy said. "Said I was in the way." She unlocked the shop door and motioned him inside. "You'll catch cold out here." He followed, looking around the dim room with its bolts of fabric and jars of buttons. She gave him a piece of cornbread left over from her supper, and he ate it without speaking, crumbs gathering at the corners of his mouth. When he left, he thanked her in the quiet way children do when they mean it, and something about that thank you settled deep in her chest. Still, the room upstairs did not feel any more her own. The bed was no softer, the stove no less temperamental. The seams of her life here were stitched loosely, always one tug away from coming apart. One night, she woke to the sound of rain hitting the roof, a hard, steady rhythm. She lay listening, thinking of the boy on the steps, the rancher fixing shingles against the coming winter. She thought of her own roof and how, even here, dry and indoors, she did not feel at home. The next day the boy appeared again, this time with a scrap of paper in his hand. It was folded small, the edges frayed. "Uncle says this is yours," he told her, just as he had before. When she opened it, she found another line of music, not the same as the last one, but clearly from the same hand. She traced the notes with her fingertip, the paper warm from where the boy had held it. "Does he write these often?" she asked. The boy shrugged. "Only when he thinks someone ought to hear it." She didn't answer. Instead, she slipped the paper into her apron pocket and felt its slight weight as she worked the rest of the day. By the week's end, she had a small stack of such scraps, fragments of songs she half recognized. Some nights she laid them out on the bed, trying to imagine the whole piece, hearing in her mind the way he'd played in the saloon. But no matter how she arranged them, there was always something missing, as though he meant her to know only part of the story. One afternoon she caught sight of him in the street, the boy trotting alongside. They were carrying a sack between them, and she realized only after they passed that it was full of kindling. His sleeve was rolled to the elbow, revealing a forearm corded with work, the skin browned by sun. He glanced at her in passing, and for the first time she thought she saw the smallest curve of a smile. It was gone before she could be sure. That night, she dreamed again of the piano, not as it was in the saloon but in a room she'd never seen. In the dream, she sat beside him on the bench, their shoulders nearly touching, the boy leaning against the doorframe, listening. The music filled the space until it felt almost visible, like dust caught in sunlight. She woke with the ache of something unfinished. The days grew colder. Frost formed on the window before dawn, and her breath showed in the air when she dressed. The boy came less often now, but when he did, he stayed longer, sometimes helping her carry bundles of mended clothes. Once, when she thanked him, he said simply, "Uncle says you work harder than anyone here." She didn't know what answer to give. One morning, while taking a delivery to the general store, she saw him again. The rancher was at the counter, paying for sacks of flour and coffee. The boy stood close by, holding a small tin as if it were precious. When they turned to leave, the rancher's gaze met hers for the briefest moment. Then he tipped his hat and stepped into the sunlight. The boy lingered just long enough to press another folded scrap into her hand before following. She waited until they were gone to open it. This time the fragment of music was longer, more complete. At the bottom, in faint pencil, was a single word: soon. She stood there, the note trembling slightly in her fingers, and felt a strange mix of anticipation and fear. She didn't know what he meant by it, or why it felt like the start of something she couldn't name. Outside, the sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving the street quiet. She tucked the paper into her coat and stepped out into the cold, the words still echoing in her mind. The first snow came earlier than most expected, catching the town half prepared. It began as a thin, dry flurry that whispered along rooftops and boardwalks, then thickened into a steady drift, laying white over the ruts of Main Street and muffling the sound of boots on wood. The air smelled faintly of iron and pine, the way it does when winter has settled in for the long haul. By dusk, the schoolhouse lanterns were lit, their glow spilling out into the falling snow like pockets of warmth in the dark. She approached slowly, her boots crunching in the thin layer that had gathered. Through the window she could see people moving between tables, ladling stew into bowls, passing baskets of bread. The harvest supper was a small-town tradition, meant to see everyone fed before the cold months tightened their grip. She had never gone before, she wasn't certain she belonged. Inside, the room was warm enough to make her cheeks sting as they thawed. The smell of stew, thick with potatoes and carrots, mingled with the sweet bite of apple pie cooling on the windowsill. She kept to the edge of the room, her hands folded in front of her, scanning for an empty place to sit where no one would ask her much. The townsfolk clustered in groups, voices weaving in and out of each other, laughter punctuating the hum. In the far corner stood the piano, its wood gleaming faintly under lamplight. It had been tuned earlier that week by a traveling tinker, and now the lid was propped open, the keys ready. A few men stood nearby, nudging one another, trying to coax someone to play. When they caught sight of the rancher, they called out to him. He shook his head at first, a small, dismissive motion, but the boy at his side tugged on his sleeve, eyes wide with expectation. Something in the man's stance softened, and without another word, he crossed the room to the bench. The crowd fell quieter as he sat, adjusting the lid with deliberate care. His fingers hovered over the keys for a breath, and then the first notes came, slow, measured, carrying a weight that filled the space more than volume ever could. She recognized the piece instantly. It was Chopin again, though different from what he had played in the saloon. Slower, with pauses that felt like held breath. The melody curled into the air, finding corners where the lamplight didn't reach, and in those moments it seemed that no one in the room could look anywhere else. She watched from her place against the wall, her hands tightening around each other. The music was not perfect. A note here and there wavered. But it was alive, and it reached her in a way words never had. She thought of the scraps of music he had sent through the boy, the way each fragment had felt like a small piece of something larger. Now she could hear what they belonged to, and it made her chest ache. The women nearest her broke into whispers. "Look at her, standing there like she's part of it," one murmured. "She'll be after him next, you watch." "After all the talk about her past?" "Not likely," the other replied, though the curl of her mouth said she enjoyed the thought. The words stung more than she wanted to admit. She kept her gaze fixed on the piano, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But inside, the old feeling of being marked, of carrying something others could not or would not forget, rose sharp as ever. The final notes faded, lingering in the rafters before the sound of hands striking together filled the space. He rose from the bench without bowing, without acknowledgement, and began moving toward the back of the room. But before he could leave, he detoured toward her. He carried a plate in one hand, stew, bread, a slice of pie balanced on the edge. Without a word, he set it on the table nearest her and took the seat beside it. She looked at him, unsure whether to speak. His presence was a kind of answer in itself, not for them but for her. They ate in silence, the noise of the room pressing around them. The boy sat across the table, swinging his legs, dunking bread into his stew. She caught him watching the two of them, his gaze curious, almost satisfied, as if some plan of his was slowly working itself out. When the meal ended, she lingered, stacking the empty bowls, waiting for the crowd to thin. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving a pale cover over the town. He stood at the doorway waiting, the boy already bundled in a coat too big for him. She hesitated, then stepped forward. "I'll walk you to your place," he said simply. It wasn't an offer. The street was quiet except for the soft creak of snow underfoot. The lamps along the boardwalk burned low, their light warm against the blue of night. The boy ran ahead, making prints in the untouched snow, his laughter carrying back to them in quick bursts. "You play differently when he's watching," she said after a while. He didn't look at her. "Maybe I play better." The cold nipped at her ears and she tucked her chin deeper into her scarf. She wanted to tell him that she had heard every note, that she knew what it was to let something show through your hands you could never say aloud. But the words caught. At the seamstress shop, she stopped at the steps. He didn't move to leave right away. The boy had run farther down the street, chasing his own shadow in the lamplight. "Those women," she began, but he cut in quietly. "They don't know you." It was not a comfort exactly, but something steadier, heavier. She nodded once, and he tipped his hat before turning away, his boots marking a slow path through the snow. That night, she laid awake, staring at the ceiling. The sound of the piano played in her mind, overlapping with the memory of his voice. She thought of the scraps of music, of the word "soon," written at the bottom of the last one. She didn't know if it was a promise, a warning, or something else entirely. The next morning, the boy arrived early, stomping snow from his feet. "Uncle says you ought to come by," he announced. "For what?" He only shrugged, grinning. "You'll see." The ranch was a mile out, the path lined with cottonwoods heavy with snow. When she reached the gate, the boy ran ahead to the barn. She hesitated before following, unsure whether she had crossed into something that wasn't hers to step into. Inside, the air was warmer, smelling of hay and horses. He was there, repairing a bridle, his sleeves rolled up, his forearms marked with the faint scars of work. He glanced up but didn't stop his hands. "Play something," he said, nodding toward the corner. She turned and saw the piano, old, its finish worn but polished enough to show someone had cared for it. A stool stood before it, a single chair set a few feet away as though for a listener. She sat slowly, running her fingertips over the keys. They were cold under her skin. The first notes came stiff, but as she found the melody, her hands began to move more easily, memory carrying her along. She played a piece her mother had taught her, one that had nothing to do with Chopin but everything to do with home. When she finished, the barn was quiet except for the shift of the horses in their stalls. He had set the bridle aside, leaning forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. "You kept that," he said. She didn't know if he meant the song or something else. The boy came barreling in then, breaking the moment, chattering about the snow on the roof and how it might slide off any minute. She rose from the stool, unsure what to do with the warmth that had settled in her chest. By the time she left the ranch, the sun was dipping, turning the snow to rose gold. The boy walked with her to the gate, pressing yet another folded scrap into her hand before running back toward the barn. She waited until she was nearly to town before opening it. This time the music was complete, a full line without breaks. And beneath it, in the same careful hand, was another word: stay. The paper felt warm against her palm despite the cold. She folded it again, slipping it into her coat, and kept walking. The snow was falling again, soft and slow, each flake vanishing as it touched her skin. Snow still clung to the fences the morning the boy appeared at the seamstress shop, stamping his feet on the boardwalk and letting in a gust of cold air when he opened the door. She was bent over the counter, sorting spools of thread, and looked up to find him grinning in the doorway like he'd just found a secret. "Uncle says you should come for supper," he announced. She blinked. "Does he?" The boy shrugged, already stepping inside as though her agreement was assumed. "He's making spaghetti. Got the stuff from a man who came from the city. Said you'd like it." She couldn't recall the last time someone had made a meal with her in mind. The thought of it warmed and unsettled her at once. She tried to protest, to say she couldn't possibly leave the shop in the evening, but the boy had already gone, leaving behind the sharp scent of cold and a faint trail of snowflakes on the floorboards. By the time she reached the ranch, the light had gone gold, sliding off the white drifts and the bare branches of the cottonwoods. The path to the house was swept clear, the boards of the porch creaking under her boots. She hesitated at the door, not wanting to knock too soon, but the boy flung it open before her hand could lift. The warmth hit her first: wood smoke, boiling water, the faint spice of something simmering. The small room was lit by a pair of oil lamps and the glow from the stove, their light softening the rough edges of the place. The rancher stood at the counter, stirring a pot. His coat hung by the door, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. Steam rose from the pot in white curls, catching the lamplight. He looked up when she stepped inside, his expression unreadable but not unwelcoming. "Bread?" he asked. She held out the loaf she'd brought, its crust still warm from the oven in the shop's tiny stove. He took it without comment, setting it on the table. The boy was already bustling about, laying out 3 mismatched plates and a fork at each place. She slipped off her gloves and found herself moving toward the stove. "What can I do?" He handed her a spoon. "Stir the sauce. Don't let it catch." The pot smelled of tomatoes and herbs, richer than anything she'd tasted since leaving home. She stirred slowly, listening to the soft hiss where the sauce met the hot sides of the pot. The boy darted between them, setting out tin cups and pouring water from a pitcher, humming tunelessly under his breath. When the pasta was drained and the sauce ladled over it, they sat at the table, a narrow, scarred thing that bore the marks of years of meals and elbows and spilled coffee. The boy dug in at once, slurping noodles with a grin. She twirled a forkful more carefully, savoring the steam that rose from it. The rancher ate in silence, his gaze dropping now and then to his plate, now and then flicking toward her. She found herself watching his hands, the way his fingers curled loosely around the fork, the way they looked just as steady here as they had on the piano keys. The boy filled the silence with talk of the day's chores, the snow that had slid off the barn roof with a sound like thunder, the tracks he'd seen by the creek that might have been a fox. She listened, nodding when he looked to her, her smile small but genuine. When the plates were nearly empty, she sat back, feeling something she hadn't expected. The particular kind of full that had less to do with food than with being allowed to share it. She traced one fingertip along a deep groove in the wood of the table, wondering how many hands had done the same before hers. "You don't laugh much," the rancher said quietly, not looking up from his plate. She froze, caught between defensiveness and the truth. "Not much to laugh about." He glanced up then, and there was no mockery in his eyes. "You laughed just now. At him." He nodded toward the boy, who was busy mopping up sauce with the last piece of bread. She realized he was right, though she couldn't remember the moment. "Maybe he earned it," she said, and the boy grinned at the praise. After the meal, she moved to clear the table, but the rancher waved her off. "Leave it. You'll take this instead." He reached under the counter and brought out a wrapped bundle, its edges worn soft with age. When she unwrapped it, the lamplight fell across the cover of a sheaf of sheet music. Chopin. The pages were creased, the ink faded in places, but the notes were still clear. Her breath caught. "I don't have the whole thing," he said. "But it's yours if you want it." She ran her fingers over the paper as if afraid it might vanish. "Why?" He shrugged, looking toward the stove. "Seems you might play it better than I can." The boy was already pulling at her hand. "You should stay and try it. Uncle's got a piano." "Not tonight," the rancher interrupted, his voice even but final. She wrapped the music again, holding it close as she stepped out into the cold. The snow had stopped, and the stars were sharp above the dark shapes of the trees. The boy called a good night from the doorway. The rancher only lifted his hand in a small wave. On the walk back, she kept the bundle under her arm, the edges warming to her skin. The music felt heavier than its weight should allow, as though it carried something more than notes. Back in her room above the seamstress shop, she lit the lamp and unwrapped it again. The first page was familiar, though she couldn't have said why. She traced the notes with her finger, hearing them in her mind. Below one of the staves, in faint pencil, was a single word: soon. She sat for a long while, the lamp hissing faintly, the cold seeping in through the thin walls. Outside, the town was quiet, the snow muffling even the sound of passing wagons. She turned the pages one by one, wondering what he meant, and whether the meaning was something she was ready to hear. When she blew out the lamp and lay down, the scent of tomatoes and wood smoke clung to her clothes. Her dreams were full of music again, but this time, There was the sound of someone else's hands on the keys beside hers. The melody was whole, and the room felt warm enough to belong to. She woke before dawn, her heart unsteady, the words still in her mind. Soon. The fire took the seamstress shop before sunrise, turning the air thick and black. She woke to shouting, the smell of smoke clawing through the thin walls of her room. When she opened the door to the hall, heat pushed against her like a living thing. She grabbed the bundle of Chopin from the small table by her bed, pressing it to her chest as she stumbled down the narrow stairs into the street. Flames had already claimed the roof, casting the town in a feverish light. Buckets passed from hand to hand in a desperate chain, but it was clear the shop would not be saved. Her room, her work, the small pieces of her life, everything was disappearing into the orange roar above her. She stood in the cold, her breath ragged, the music clutched so tightly her knuckles ached. Through the smoke, a horse's dark shape emerged, snow spraying from its hooves. The rancher dismounted in one motion, his coat dusted white, his eyes fixed on her. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He didn't ask if she had anywhere to go. He simply took her arm, the warmth of his hand cutting through the cold. "Come," he said, and she went. The boy was waiting at the edge of town, holding the reins of another horse. He fell in beside them without a word, glancing at her only once, as if to make sure she was real and not some wisp of smoke carried on the wind. The snow fell harder as they rode, the town fading behind them into the dark. At the ranch, he led her inside, past the stove already burning hot. "You'll take my room," he said, as if there could be no argument. He took the bundle from her hands and set it on the small table in the corner, his touch on it careful, almost reverent. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm she hadn't known she needed. She rose with the light, helped the boy feed the stock, mended clothes with scraps from his old shirts. The air in the house held the smell of coffee in the mornings, wood smoke in the evenings. She began to feel the weight in her shoulders ease, though she could not name what was being lifted. It was on the fourth night that she found him at the piano. The lamps were turned low, the boy already asleep upstairs. He sat with his back straight, the sheet music open in front of him. His hands moved over the keys, the notes familiar but halting, like someone speaking in a language they once knew well. She stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath her. He didn't turn. "I used to play this for her," he said quietly, "before she got sick." She understood without needing to ask who her was. When he faltered in the middle of a measure, she moved to the bench beside him. "Let me." He shifted to make space, their knees nearly touching. Her fingers found the melody with a steadiness she hadn't expected after so many years. The music rose and filled the small room, curling into the corners like something meant to be kept. Halfway through, he placed his hand over hers. She stopped, the last note hanging in the air. "Marry me," he said, not as a plea but as if stating the only thing left to say. She stared at him, her breath caught somewhere between the past and the moment. "If you can play Chopin, I'll marry you right here," she whispered, the words almost the same as that first day in the saloon, though they carried no jest now. His mouth curved just slightly. He turned back to the keys and began again, slower this time, but sure enough to carry the song to its end. The final note lingered between them before fading into the quiet. She didn't speak. She simply laid her hand over his, their fingers curling together on the cool ivory. Outside, the snow was falling again, soft and certain, covering the tracks that had brought her here. In the lamplight, the sheet music lay open on the table, the pages worn but still legible, the song intact at last. It wasn't a mansion or a wedding or a promise made loud. It was spaghetti on a wooden table, and the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. And maybe that's how homes are made, one small kindness at a time.